For decades, Karl Malone was seen as indestructible, built like a fortress and powered by relentless discipline. He was the embodiment of endurance in professional basketball. Fans called him the mailman because he always delivered. Night after night, season after season, pain never seemed to slow him. Time never seemed to catch him. While other stars burned brightly and faded, Malone endured, grinding his way into the record books through sheer force of will. Yet at 62, when the applause has faded and the banners belong to others, his story feels far less heroic than it once did. Malone's journey began far from bright lights and sold-out arenas. He grew up in rural Louisiana, raised by a single mother after his father died by suicide when Karl was still a teenager. That early trauma shaped him deeply. He learned quickly that survival required strength, silence, and self-reliance. Emotions were luxuries. Vulnerability was weakness. Basketball became his escape, not just from poverty, but from grief he never truly processed. The court gave him structure. It gave him control. It gave him a place where pain could be converted into purpose. When Malone entered the NBA in 1985, he was not celebrated as a future icon. He was viewed as raw, aggressive, and overly physical. Utah was not New York or Los Angeles. There were no flashing cameras or celebrity crowds. But in that quiet environment, Malone found his rhythm. Alongside John Stockton, he formed one of the most efficient and punishing partnerships the league had ever seen. Pick and roll after pick and roll. Precision mixed with brute force. Together, they turned consistency into an art form. Statistically, Malone became undeniable. Points piled up. All-star appearances became routine. Awards followed. Longevity separated him from nearly everyone who ever played the game. Yet despite all of it, something always felt missing. He was respected, but rarely adored. Admired, but not embraced. Fans saw the production, but struggled to connect with the man behind it. Malone kept his distance. He spoke little. He trusted few. Fame surrounded him, yet isolation followed closely behind. Then came the moments that were supposed to define him forever. The NBA Finals in the late 1990s. 2 seasons where destiny seemed almost certain. The Utah Jazz were at their peak, and Malone was at the center of everything. But standing in their way was Michael Jordan. Twice, Malone watched his championship dreams collapse under the weight of history. Those losses were not just defeats on a scoreboard. They were emotional fractures. Years of sacrifice undone in a handful of moments. Still, Malone refused to accept an ending without a ring. Late in his career, he joined the Los Angeles Lakers in a final, desperate attempt at redemption. It looked promising on paper, yet reality was unforgiving. Injuries limited him. Chemistry failed. Another finals loss followed. And with that, the last door quietly closed. After retirement, the image of Karl Malone began to change. Allegations from his past resurfaced, forcing fans and historians to confront deeply uncomfortable truths. Suddenly, the clean narrative of hard work and perseverance became complicated. For many, admiration turned into disappointment. For others, it became impossible to separate his achievements from his personal actions. The debate around his legacy grew louder, even as Malone himself retreated further into silence. At 62, Karl Malone stands as one of the most complex figures in sports history. A man who conquered physical limits, yet could not outrun the shadows of his own life. His body carried him further than almost anyone else. But his legacy, once simple and heroic, now exists in tension between greatness and accountability. The tragedy of Karl Malone is not defined by the championships he never won. It is defined by the reality that even the strongest men cannot escape the weight of unresolved truths. And as time moves forward, his story forces an uncomfortable question. When the numbers fade and the noise disappears, what truly remains of a legend who spent his entire life delivering, but never quite found peace? By the time Karl Malone walked away from the NBA, the numbers told one story, but time began telling another. Retirement should have been a victory lap, a period where legends are softened by nostalgia and forgiven by distance. For Malone, it became the opposite. Silence did not protect him. Time did not heal his image. Instead, the years after basketball slowly peeled away the armor he had worn for decades. Away from the court, Malone never embraced the role of a celebrated elder statesman. He did not become a regular television presence. He did not cultivate the warmth that often reshapes public memory. While other retired stars reinvented themselves as mentors, analysts, or cultural icons, Malone withdrew. He returned to a quieter life, one that mirrored the isolation of his upbringing more than the fame of his playing days. To some, this felt humble. To others, it felt evasive. Then came the resurfacing of long-buried allegations from his past. Stories that many fans either did not know or chose not to confront began circulating widely. These revelations forced a brutal reassessment of who Karl Malone was beyond the hardwood. The discussion was no longer about pick and rolls or MVP trophies. It became about morality, responsibility, and accountability. For many, the dissonance was overwhelming. How could a man celebrated for discipline and toughness carry such unresolved controversy? What made it more unsettling was Malone's response, or a lack of one. There were no extended public apologies, no emotional interviews offering reflection or remorse. Instead, there was distance, short statements, controlled appearances. The same emotional restraint that once defined his playing style now worked against him. In a modern era that demands transparency, silence reads differently. It is no longer strength. It is suspicion. As the basketball world evolved, Malone's absence from major league celebrations became more noticeable. Anniversary teams, documentary tributes, league-wide retrospectives. His name was often included, but rarely highlighted. When it was mentioned, it came with qualifiers. Greatness followed by discomfort. Achievement followed by controversy. The simplicity of his legacy was gone forever. Even his greatest partnership, the one with John Stockton, began to feel distant in retrospect. What was once praised as perfect chemistry now looked like two men bound by efficiency rather than emotional connection. Their success was undeniable, but lacked the mythic warmth fans associate with legendary duos. They won relentlessly, yet left behind few iconic moments of joy. No championship parade, no final catharsis, just numbers and near misses. Physically, Malone also began to show signs of mortality. The Iron Man of the NBA could not escape time. Injuries that he once played through began to echo later in life. Pain lingered. Movement slowed. The body that had been his greatest asset now served as a daily reminder of what it had endured. For someone who defined himself through strength, this decline carried a quiet cruelty. Emotionally, Malone remained guarded. Interviews revealed little introspection. He spoke about work, about effort, about basketball fundamentals, rarely about regret, rarely about loss beyond the court. Yet those close to the game could sense it. The weight of unfinished business, the ring that never came, the image that could never be repaired. These are burdens no training regimen could fix. What makes Malone's tragedy uniquely painful is that his fall was not sudden. There was no single scandal that destroyed him overnight. Instead, it was erosion, a gradual wearing away of admiration as context replaced myth. Fans grew older. Information became unavoidable. And the league itself moved toward a more values-driven conversation about its heroes. At 62, Karl Malone exists as a cautionary figure. Proof that dominance does not guarantee absolution. That success without reflection can harden rather than heal. He gave everything to basketball, but basketball could not save him from himself. The court rewarded his body. It could not redeem his choices. The tragedy is not that he is remembered differently now. It is that the version of Karl Malone the world once believed in can never return. And no matter how many points he scored, some distances cannot be closed. Some legacies once fractured never fully recover. As the years passed, the conversation around Karl Malone shifted from admiration to discomfort and eventually to something heavier. It was no longer just about what he achieved, but about how history should treat him. The NBA, a league increasingly aware of its image and moral responsibility, found itself in an uneasy position. Malone's records could not be erased. His impact on the game could not be denied. Yet celebrating him without context felt wrong to many, especially to a younger generation raised in an era where accountability matters as much as accomplishment. This tension became most visible during league-wide commemorations. When anniversaries rolled around and the greatest players were honored, Malone's presence felt complicated. He was included because excluding him would rewrite history. But he was rarely centered, rarely spotlighted, rarely celebrated with the same warmth afforded to others of his caliber. It was as if the league acknowledged his existence while quietly stepping around his legacy. For fans, this created a strange emotional divide. Older viewers remembered the relentless forward who punished defenses and never missed a game. Younger fans encountered him first through controversy, not highlights. To them, the numbers felt abstract, disconnected from the man behind them. This generational gap ensured that Malone's story would never settle into a single, agreed-upon narrative. It would remain fractured, argued, unresolved. Perhaps the most haunting element of Malone's tragedy is how close he came to rewriting everything. A single championship could have altered perception, softened judgment, and provided a redemptive arc. Sports history is full of flawed champions whose rings became shields against criticism. Malone never had that shield. Every failure, every controversy, every unanswered question stood exposed. There is also the matter of forgiveness. Malone's refusal to publicly engage with his past left little room for reconciliation. In an age where even deeply flawed figures attempt public reckoning, his silence felt like resistance. Some interpreted it as pride, others as shame. But without clarity, audiences filled the void themselves. And speculation, once unleashed, is rarely kind. Those who defended Malone often pointed to his upbringing, the trauma of losing his father, the emotional tools he never learned, the environment that shaped him long before fame arrived. These explanations provided context, but not absolution. Understanding why someone becomes who they are does not erase the consequences of their actions. And that distinction lies at the heart of his legacy. Meanwhile, Malone himself aged quietly. No dramatic downfall, no public redemption tour, just a slow fade from relevance. The arenas he once dominated now echoed with new names. His records remained, but records alone do not keep a legend alive. Stories do, and Malone's story became one many preferred not to tell. What lingers most painfully is the sense of isolation. For someone who spent his life surrounded by teammates, opponents, and roaring crowds, Malone's later years appeared solitary. Fame had given him visibility, not connection. Success had given him respect, not peace. When basketball ended, it took with it the one language he knew how to speak fluently. At 62, Karl Malone is no longer battling defenders or chasing championships. He is battling memory. How he will be remembered. What parts of his story will survive? Which moments will define him when future generations look back? That is a fight far more difficult than any playoff series. The tragedy of Karl Malone is not simply about downfall or disgrace. It is about incompleteness. A life of extraordinary achievement that never arrived at emotional resolution. A man who mastered his craft but never mastered himself. And in that sense, his story stands as a stark reminder that greatness without introspection can leave behind a legacy that feels heavy rather than inspiring. History will not forget Karl Malone. It cannot, but it may never fully forgive him either. And that uneasy space between remembrance and rejection is where his story now rests. What makes Karl Malone's story linger is not outrage, but unease. Outrage fades with time. Unease does not. It settles quietly into collective memory, shaping how a figure is discussed in hushed tones rather than shouted praise. For Malone, this unease has become the defining atmosphere around his name. Not condemnation loud enough to erase him, Not forgiveness strong enough to redeem him, but a persistent discomfort that refuses to go away. As sports culture evolved, the idea of separating the athlete from the person became harder to defend. In earlier eras, performance often eclipsed personal conduct. Winning covered flaws. Dominance excused silence. But the modern audience asks different questions. Who benefited? Who was harmed? Who took responsibility? And who never did? Under this lens, Malone's achievements feel heavier, not lighter. They carry moral weight that statistics were never designed to bear. This shift has altered how Malone is taught, discussed, and remembered. He appears in record books, but rarely in inspirational narratives. Coaches still reference his work ethic. Analysts still cite his durability. Yet there is a noticeable absence of reverence. The warmth that usually surrounds all-time greats never quite arrives. His story is delivered cautiously, as if every compliment must be balanced with an unspoken asterisk. Even within basketball circles, opinions remain divided. Some former players defend him fiercely, arguing that the court should be the only place judgment is rendered. Others admit discomfort, acknowledging that talent does not absolve harm. This division ensures that Malone's name sparks debate rather than celebration. And debate is not how legends are usually honored. One of the most striking aspects of Malone's later life is how little closure it offers. There is no final speech that reframes everything. No documentary that carefully rebuilds his image. No public reckoning that invites forgiveness. The story simply stops. Or rather, it trails off, unresolved, leaving audiences to decide what to do with the discomfort. For Malone, this lack of resolution may be the greatest punishment of all. Athletes are accustomed to endings. A final game, a retirement ceremony, a last roar of applause. Malone never received that emotional punctuation. His career ended quietly. His reputation unraveled slowly, and the silence that followed became permanent. There's also the question of self-awareness. Did Malone ever truly understand how the world would see him in the end? Or did he believe that time would smooth everything over, as it has for so many before him? If so, he miscalculated. The world changed faster than his legacy could adapt. And by the time it did, he had already withdrawn. At 62, Malone occupies a rare category. He is not a fallen hero in the dramatic sense. There was no single moment when everything collapsed. Instead, his legacy eroded under scrutiny, layer by layer, fact by fact, until the figure that remained felt incomplete, uncomfortable, and difficult to place. This is why his tragedy resonates beyond basketball. It speaks to a broader truth about success without reflection, about what happens when discipline is applied only outwardly, never inwardly. Malone trained his body relentlessly. He mastered routine. He conquered pain. But emotional growth was never part of the regimen. And without it, greatness becomes brittle. The most painful irony is that Malone spent his entire career delivering points, screens, consistency, reliability. Yet when it came time to deliver clarity, accountability, or closure, nothing arrived. The mailman for once did not come. In the end, Karl Malone's story is not a warning about fame or fortune. It is a warning about imbalance, about building a life around achievement while neglecting responsibility, about assuming strength can replace introspection. It cannot. History will continue to list his accomplishments. Fans will continue to argue his place among the greatest. But the emotional center of his story will remain hollow. And that hollowness is what defines the tragedy. Not failure, not scandal, but a legacy that feels unfinished, heavy, and forever unresolved. As time continues to move forward, the question surrounding Karl Malone is no longer about judgment. Judgment has already happened, quietly and collectively. The more difficult question is what comes after. How does history hold someone who cannot be erased, but cannot be embraced either? This is the space Malone now occupies, and it is one of the loneliest places a public figure can exist. For future generations, Malone's story will likely arrive without the emotional context that once softened it. They will not remember the roar of the Delta Center. They will not feel the frustration of watching the Jazz fall just short in the finals. They will encounter his name first through summaries, footnotes, and uncomfortable discussions. The highlights will still exist, but they will be framed differently. Not as celebration, but as reference. Not as inspiration, but as evidence. This is how legacies change. Not overnight, but gradually, as memory shifts from lived experience to recorded history. When that happens, nuance often disappears. What remains are symbols. And Malone risks becoming a symbol not of perseverance, but of unresolved contradiction. A reminder that greatness and moral failure can coexist in the same body, in the same lifetime. The NBA itself will likely continue its careful distance. His records will stand. His statistics will remain. But institutional enthusiasm will be limited. He will be present in the archive, but rarely elevated in the narrative. This is not punishment in an official sense. It is something quieter. A choice about what kind of legacy the league wishes to project as it defines its values. There is also the human element that statistics and debates often overlook. Aging brings reflection, whether one welcomes it or not. At 62, Malone has lived long enough to see the world reinterpret him, to watch admiration turn conditional, to feel relevance slip away not because of physical decline, but because the conversation moved beyond what he was prepared to confront. For someone who built his identity on control, this loss of narrative control may be the most unsettling experience of all. He can no longer define himself solely by effort and output. Others now complete the story for him, and their version does not ask his permission. Some believe time will soften everything. That decades from now, the controversy will fade and the basketball resume will regain prominence. History, however, does not suggest this outcome is guaranteed. In fact, modern history tends to do the opposite. It sharpens context. It revisits uncomfortable truths. It refuses to forget simply because forgetting is convenient. If reconciliation is ever possible, it would require something Malone has never publicly offered: openness, accountability, a willingness to step into discomfort rather than retreat from it. Without that, the story remains frozen, static, locked in tension. And yet, there is tragedy even in that. Because Malone is not a fictional villain. He is a human being shaped by trauma, success, and long-standing emotional armor. His failures do not erase his pain. His pain does not excuse his failures. Both truths exist at once, and neither fully resolves the other. This is why his story continues to unsettle. It resists clean conclusions. It refuses to fit into the familiar arcs of redemption or downfall. There is no satisfying ending, only an ongoing reckoning that grows quieter with each passing year. At 62, Karl Malone's life stands as a testament to the limits of achievement, to the idea that you can outrun defenders, outlast opponents, and outwork nearly everyone, yet still be caught by the parts of yourself you never confronted. Basketball gave him everything it could. Fame gave him reach. Strength gave him survival. But none of them gave him peace. In the end, the tragedy of Karl Malone is not about how he fell. It is about how he never fully arrived. Not at resolution. Not at understanding. Not at redemption. His story remains suspended between greatness and regret, forever incomplete, forever heavy. In the final stage of any legacy, noise gives way to silence. Interviews stop. Opinions settle. Arguments lose urgency. What remains is not the heat of debate, but the cold permanence of history. This is where Karl Malone's story now drifts, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow, almost imperceptible quiet that feels heavier than outrage ever could. Silence has always followed Malone. It shaped his childhood, hardened his demeanor, and later became a shield. On the court, silence was useful. It kept emotion from interfering with execution. It turned pain into routine. It allowed him to endure when others broke. But in retirement, that same silence became a void. And history does not fill voids kindly. As years pass, the people who once defended Malone with passion grow tired of repeating the same arguments. Those who criticized him no longer need to raise their voices. The facts sit where they are. Public memory no longer feels the need to persuade. It simply records. And recording without emotion is often the harshest judgment of all. Malone's absence from cultural relevance accelerates this process. There are no new moments to reframe perception, no evolving narrative to soften edges. Without engagement, a legacy becomes static, and static legacies are vulnerable to simplification. Complex human stories flatten into cautionary symbols. This is the quiet and many powerful figures never anticipate. Not disgrace, not redemption, but a relevance shaped by unresolved truth. Malone is still spoken about, but rarely wondered about. His name surfaces, but it does not invite curiosity. It invites conclusion. There's also a deeper loneliness embedded in this stage. Athletes often struggle after retirement because the structure that once gave them meaning disappears. For Malone, that structure was more than a career. It was an identity. Basketball was the place where effort translated cleanly into reward, where discipline guaranteed results, where strength mattered. Outside of it, those rules no longer applied. Life after basketball demanded something Malone never publicly demonstrated comfort with. Reflection without competition. Accountability without scoreboards. Growth without training schedules. These are quieter challenges, but far more difficult for someone who built his life on external validation through performance. In the absence of public reconciliation, people speculate about private reckoning. Does Malone look back differently now? Does age soften certainty? Does solitude invite reflection he once avoided? These questions linger, unanswered, and because they are unanswered, they do not heal. They simply remain. This unresolved state affects how his story will be told long after he is gone. Documentaries will mention him carefully. Analysts will contextualize his greatness. Educators will explain the controversy. His name will appear in discussions about complexity rather than celebration. He will be used as an example, not an aspiration. That distinction matters. Aspiration invites admiration. Example invites caution. Malone's life, once held up as proof of endurance and work ethic, now carries a different lesson. That discipline without introspection can build extraordinary careers and deeply flawed legacies at the same time. There is tragedy in that lesson because it did not have to end this way. The possibility of reflection, acknowledgement, and growth never fully disappeared. It simply went unclaimed. And history rarely rewards what is left undone. At 62, Malone's story feels finished in outcome, but unfinished in meaning. The arc has reached its endpoint, but without resolution. The final chapter exists, but offers no closure, only distance. When future generations study the great players of his era, they will learn about dominance, durability, and numbers that seem unreal. But they will also learn about silence, about what happens when personal accountability never enters the conversation, about how greatness can endure physically while eroding morally. This is not a story of a man destroyed by failure. It is a story of a man limited by his own refusal to evolve beyond strength. And that limitation defines his ending more than any missed free throw or lost final series ever could. The tragedy of Karl Malone ultimately settles into something profoundly human. A reminder that success does not guarantee wisdom, that achievement does not ensure understanding, and that without the courage to confront oneself, even the most powerful legacies can end not with a roar, but with a quiet, permanent fade. In the end, every public life is reduced to a question history cannot avoid asking. Not how loud the applause was, not how high the numbers climbed, but what remains when memory is stripped of emotion. When Karl Malone's name surfaces decades from now, it will not arrive with a single feeling. It will arrive with tension. And tension is a difficult inheritance. For many legends, time acts as a softening agent. Rough edges blur. Flaws fade. Achievements glow brighter as controversy loses urgency. Malone's story resists that pattern. Time does not dilute it. Time clarifies it. Each passing year sharpens the contrast between what he accomplished and what he never confronted. And that contrast becomes the core of his remembrance. The world often wants its heroes simple, strong, inspiring, redeemed. Malone does not fit that mold. He forces an uncomfortable acknowledgement that excellence can coexist with moral failure, and that one does not automatically cancel the other. This is not a comforting truth, which is why his legacy remains unsettled. It demands maturity from those who engage with it. It asks viewers, fans, and historians to sit with complexity rather than resolve it. As generations pass, fewer people will remember watching him play live. The physical dominance that once defined him will exist only through grainy footage and statistical summaries. What will endure instead is interpretation. And interpretation is shaped not by what a person did best, but by what their story represents. Malone's story represents a limit. The limit of strength without introspection. The limit of discipline without accountability. The limit of achievement as a substitute for emotional growth. These are not lessons taught by highlight reels, but they are lessons history will emphasize because they remain relevant long after the game itself evolves. There is also a quieter tragedy embedded here. For all the debate, Malone himself may never feel fully known. Public figures often fear being misunderstood, yet Malone's distance ensured that misunderstanding would define him. Silence protected him in the short term. In the long term, it allowed others to complete his story without him. To be remembered is not merely to be recorded. It is to be understood. And understanding requires engagement, vulnerability, and acknowledgement. Without those, remembrance becomes cold. Accurate, perhaps. Comprehensive, maybe, but never warm. Some will argue that basketball history should remain separate from personal history, that the court is its own domain, governed only by performance. But even that argument weakens with time. Sports are not isolated from culture. Athletes are not abstract figures. They are participants in the same moral universe as everyone else. And history increasingly refuses to compartmentalize what once felt convenient to separate. What remains most haunting is how close Malone came to a different ending. Not through a championship, but through reckoning. A sincere engagement with his past could have altered the tone of his legacy, even if it did not erase its weight. Growth does not require perfection. It requires acknowledgement. That opportunity, however, passed quietly. Now, Malone's story rests in stillness. Not erased, not exalted, preserved in complexity. A figure neither fully condemned nor fully embraced. A reminder that history does not always deliver verdicts. Sometimes, it simply presents evidence and leaves judgment to those who come after. When future voices speak his name, they will do so carefully. They will mention dominance. They will mention durability. And they will mention controversy, all in the same breath. That breath will carry no applause, no boos, just recognition. This is what it means to be remembered without redemption, to exist permanently in the space between greatness and regret, to be studied rather than celebrated, to be referenced rather than revered. Karl Malone's tragedy is not that his story ended quietly. It is that it never truly resolved. And unresolved stories do not fade. They linger. They challenge. They unsettle. In that sense, his legacy may be more enduring than many realize. Not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a mirror, reflecting the uncomfortable truth that what we achieve can be extraordinary and still not be enough to define who we are.